Welcome, everybody. I'm so lucky to be here today with Jim Langley. I think thought leader is not enough. It's more like Sherpa guru. I don't know. I don't know exactly, but definitely an influential thinker and writer about philanthropy. Welcome, Jim. How are you?
Good morning, Louis. Glad to be with you as always.
This is wonderful. So we've been very lucky to be able to call on Jim to share some of his thoughts on philanthropy, how the pandemic has impacted organizations, how the last 30 years have impacted nonprofit organizations, but also to hear from you. So if you have questions, I will be moderating them or following them in the chat. Please feel free to type them in. And in fact, I kind of learned this from you, Jim. We'd love to learn who you are, who you're where you're listening from, and what organization you're with. So feel free to introduce yourself, and we can get the conversation started. So Jim, I'll just kick it off with a really quick question, and it is related to the pandemic.
Sure.
What do you see as the primary difference between organizations that, in your opinion, have really taken advantage of this disruption and those that have kind of fallen victim to it?
Yeah, I think the big advantage are those who didn't simply back away because they were in a pandemic, understood that they had to maintain community and connection, and did so through some very interesting program, which they had to innovate around quickly, and they did that, and they somehow managed to keep up conversations, which I think is critical in building support over time. You've got to keep up not only communication in terms of one way, but make it as dialogic as you possibly can. So, provocative programming that invites questions, Q&A, response to constituent concerns. They simply maintained a kind of a presence, and they didn't go, the pandemic has changed the basic equation, which is, if you want a relationship, you have to keep talking. And without relationships, things erode. If you don't pay attention to relationships, they erode. People gravitate to where they're valued. People gravitate to what I'll call the piazza, where all the energy is, right? So if you're in the fundraising business, you have to be present, you have to be interactive, and I think you have to be provocative, not in terms of just, stimulating attention, but causing people to think about the importance of what you do, the urgency of what you do. And so that's what the best ones did.
Jim, what do you tell people who say, all of this sounds good in principle, and I feel like it's the right thing to do, but how do I prove that it works? Or maybe they talk to you about what is the ROI on kind of being responsive and engaging people?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. We've been driven by a false ROI in many ways, which is dollars. And so we've seen dollars up and donors down. And you talked about for decades at the outset, Louis. So 30, 40 years we've seen a trend. And now we have lost donors from a high of 74% of giving households in the U.S. in 1990. About 74% of Americans gave, down to 49.6. So my pushback is, don't tell me about metrics when you ignored an erosion of donors. And guess what? This business can't be sustained if we keep losing donors and keep increasing the number of nonprofits. What you have is more people competing for less, and what you have are more people competing for that precious segment of wealth, which is giving 80, 90% of support for many institutions. So you look at that and say, well, that dollar metric led us to this point. So we've got to have a donor retention metric that gets us out of it just in the short run. And in the long run, we've got to rebuild community. So it really is, going forward is, are you drawing any new energy in? Not just in terms of donors, but can you point to new constituents crossing your threshold, actually or virtually? Can you talk to any younger, middle-aged people coming in that can be converted to donors? Otherwise, all you're doing is scrambling around in that known, increasingly compressed increasingly small universe of known donors trying to grab your share. It's a desperate game, and it's going to get more desperate as time goes on.
Exactly. All the trends seem to point in that direction, and I'm sure you have also seen campaigns that rely on this one last $50 million donor, or just
That's it.
Or else you won't make it, right?
One or two or
It's
three
happening.
donors bailing them out, and then you look at the age of those donors, right? But you know, what's tragic, of course, is when you look at the most philanthropic countries, the way we measure them, giving to institutions, you see who? You see democracies, United States, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, UK, right? Philanthropy, as we describe it, is a function of democracy, and what we're seeing is the de-democratization of philanthropy, which is predictive of other kind of social ills and social strains. This is not something that stands alone. You know, we go, oh, gee, fewer donors, but let's get some more money. It's, wait a second, can we all step back and say, our democracies are under stress and strain. We see it in the rise of strongmen. We see it in the rise of polarization. We see it in the rise of, you know, all the things that should be worrying us. And this backing away from institutional support is predictive of more difficult times ahead. And the concentration of wealth in fewer hands and the dependency on that is predictive of de-democratization, which means fewer people are going to exert more significant influence on essentially democratic institutions, what should be democratic institutions. We, the people, creating more perfect institutions, more perfect union. There ain't many we in the people anymore.
Jim, so between us, do you have faith that this can still be turned around?
Of course I do, yeah, because I think what I see is while people back away from institutions, they're still doing good with their lives, right? So you see grandparents putting their grandchildren through school. That doesn't show up on tax records, but it's philanthropic. You see people giving remarkable tips to waitstaffs to keep restaurants alive, to help struggling waitstaff, sometimes giving tips larger than the cost of the meal. This was happening throughout the pandemic when I was talking to waitstaff. And how touched they were by it. The story doesn't get reported anywhere except the occasional really remarkable tip when somebody leaves $1,000. But this was going on, you know. So I see the goodness in people when disaster strikes of reaching out. I see crowdfunding for friends who have expensive operations. I see below the surface goodness being exercised, people helping people. What I see is institutions lost the trust of those good people. So those good people are going to continue to do good. The question is, can institutions listen, engage in a more humble, more peer-oriented way, in a less entitled, expectant way?
So something that fascinates me about your trajectory, Jim, is your trajectory. Is that you have a career that has spanned kind of very different fundraising environments, right?
Yes.
And I see how people tend to think of what happened now, what happened in the last 12 months.
Yes.
Versus kind of looking at the longer evolution. And I think you're one of the few thinkers that's kind of taking the long-term view of where we're headed. So do you see that the solution or the changes that are needed, do you see those being made at the individual organization level? Or is it more a matter of associations, or is it just kind of the rank and file fundraiser that needs to really rethink how they're approaching their craft?
Yeah, it's such a good question. So, you know, let's look at regeneration, because there's clearly, when you look at us sociologically or historically, we're in a degenerative period. I don't mean to say that in a despairing way, but, you know, look at all that evidence of institutions losing momentum, losing ground, and look at the erosion of trust as, you know, something that is measured toward institutions around the globe. So there is this erosion of trust. So how will trust be rebuilt? And in general, it will be rebuilt in smaller organizations that are closer to the ground, that are listening, that are more service oriented, that are leaner, that don't have administrative bloat, that simply are responsive. So, if we respond, people are grateful. If we start a virtuous cycle, people respond. Funny example of this, but it shows you. You go into, before COVID, maybe it's happening now through drive-through, but you go into a Starbucks and somebody says the person in front of you paid for your drink. What do? 9 out of 10 people say, well, I'll do the same for the people behind me. This has gone on, again, one of these funny stories, and it will go on the whole day. Right? So it's so interesting when something kind, as somebody opens a door for us, somebody says, have a good day, right? We respond. Most of us. There are the sort of sociopathic or the egotistical or the narcissistic who don't, but thank God they're in the minority. So you see, it gets back to something so basic of doing good deeds in a tangible, palpable way that starts this virtuous cycle that results in this thing called philanthropy. When I was at Georgetown, Lois, we sent students out to interview lapsed alumni donors and stipulated they wouldn't be asked, and simply asked about their animating passions. And they were so grateful to be treated so respectfully by impressive young people that they gave without asking, you see? So we keep trying to make people give through fundraising technique rather than doing good deeds, doing respectful things, doing kind things that make people want to give. Smaller organizations will get that, or people within organizations will start little mini revolutions in their own way who get it, right? So I just believe that when times get tough, the goodness comes out in the best people, and it will happen. And somehow critical mass will start to form. In my writing and your writing, what are we seeing in our posts that we're doing in our social media? What are we seeing? A fervency and response. Yes, I feel this way. We're seeing kindred spirits saying, I'm experiencing the same thing. I ascribe to the same thoughts. Let's make something happen. Then the question becomes, how do we do it? In small ways, but each from our own auspices. Or if we're in positions of power, maybe big ways, until we reach critical mass, until a movement. And I think we're in the middle of a movement, and I think you're part of it. I think I'm part of it. We're in the middle of a movement that says, let's regenerate something more noble, more decent, more fundamentally kind, more joyous. Maybe we won't call it fundraising anymore. Maybe we'll call it something else. But let's be more about the doing of good, knowing it will stimulate the good in others, and part of that stimulation will be this beautiful thing we call philanthropy.
My goodness, Jim, you've just expressed it so much better than I ever could. I invite everybody that's here today to follow Jim on LinkedIn. He posts pretty regularly and always thought-provoking and inspiring pieces. I want to thank some of the people that have already started saying hi in the chat. Lots of good friends, Dan Sonners. Many of them are Donor Participation Project members too. So I'm showing my t-shirt, which is my small advertisement for the day. I promise it's the last one, but if you like it, Google it. It's a fun group to be a part of, and we are kind of doing a revolution, like Jim says. Shelley Cornell,
and Louis, I want to encourage everybody to follow you on LinkedIn if they're not doing too as well. So I'm a follower, and you're doing wonderful stuff, and some of the names that are on here are doing wonderful things. You see, we're kindred spirits. And we're trying to get to the fundamentals of doing good that promotes philanthropy. So let's keep it up, and let's ask some tough questions about how that can be done. How does that start?
So I would invite people in the audience today to say, okay, all of this sounds beautiful, but in my specific situation, I have this question. What should I start doing about this today? Not, think about what the future holds for us, whether it's bleak or bright, but what can I do today? Right, Jim? Is that kind of what we?
That's it. And don't be afraid to challenge. It says, okay, take us from theory to practice. What can I do? Here's what I do. What can I do? Or give us some suggestions in my own small way. I may work in a sweatshop, But every time I call a donor, I show a genuine interest. I ask probing questions. I ask the sort of meaning of life questions. I show respect by deep listening. I don't hustle them. I respond to what they say. I'll give you a quick example. Maybe it'll prime some anecdotes. I was doing a feasibility study a few years ago, and I went and visited a fellow in New York, and I sent a white paper in advance. So I sat down and said, thank you for your time. I want your candid reaction to this initiative. And his reaction was outrage. He was upset, and he said, I don't give bleep, 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 string of expletives about that institution. I don't give bleep, bleep, bleep about this initiative. And it was a quite an innovative and vivid string of expletives that rarely are strung together so beautifully and so intensely. So, here I am representing that institution. What did I do? I said, I came for candor. You've given it. What do you care about? Just tell me what you care about. So, I leave the wiser. He said, I care about prostate cancer. I said, do you have it? He said, yes. I didn't care about the organization I was representing at that point either. Now I had a man who was upset and worried about his health, worried about his life. And so we just talked about that. But by the time I left, we were kindred spirits. And I would suspect that he felt much better about the institution I represented because they hired someone who wasn't insensitive, a hired gun, and just simply had his own agenda. So, can you relate to that? Can you share things where you've responded to a complaint and just sat with somebody, where you had a busy day and somebody disrupted it because they wanted to talk, but they were a nice donor, a loyal donor, and you just forgot about your busy day and your agenda? You see, these are the things I think that will keep donors feeling as if they matter, that somebody cares about them, and this will pay huge dividends in terms of retention. And Lewis and I can tell you how much retention means over time in terms of productivity. Does that ring a bell with folks? And anybody want to chime in there or share a story? Lewis, anything with you?
I'm going to share something that I'm actually doing that you inspired our team to do at Muhlenberg, which is you mentioned how visits or phone-a-thon calls do not only have to be about the ask, they can actually be a form of market research.
Yes.
Hopefully you leverage into feeding other information other than dollars in and calls made back to your leadership.
Yes.
Which will inspire a different way of thinking.
Yes.
Sometimes it's just a matter of what information the folks at the top have. So we've started doing that. And frankly, I put together focus groups, and I say,
yes.
My one-on-ones with my supervisor, who is absolutely marvelous, will be, this is what we're hearing. This is, what donors are saying right now.
Yes.
And it does change the way people think about and look at things. So, that's, I would say, courtesy of Jim Langley.
Well, thank you. I'm glad I was a part of that. But, what are we seeing is all of us, what are we seeing? We're seeing a growing gap in most places between what organizations want from donors and what donors want from organizations they're going to give to, this gap. And when we listen, we go, oh, we're doing X, or we're saying X, and they want Y. Oh, right. So just the listening in any form, surveys, interpersonally, having anybody who's on point with the donor poll with certain questions, right? So everybody in the organization is probing in a similar way. Intelligence comes into that goes, oh my goodness, we keep telling them, this is important, and they know that, but they're wondering about what we're doing over here, right? And so all of a sudden you realize maybe you're telling people what they already know and missing things that you think might be obvious, but they aren't. It's just fascinating what we take for granted in trying to achieve across a stronger conjunction of purposes. So it's just like, well, if I keep assuming you and I are in the same wavelength, it's not a good sign in any relationship. You got to check in every once in a while. What we're doing makes sense. You see anything we might be missing? What's happening in your life you think we need to catch up with? And I would call that just good conversation, Louis. Look at healthy relationships, and these kinds of good conversations are occurring all the time, but they're so rare to find in institutional strategies. It's like, how hard is it just to start better conversations with constituents in any way you can, which is, how's your day? What are you up against? What's frustrating you? And then out of that, you find common cause, but you really start with genuine interest, not agendas.
Absolutely, Jim. Thank you so much. And we have already 3 or 4 questions in the chat. I'll ask you the first one from Dan Saunders. What first step can nonprofits take to build community with and among their donors?
My favorite thing with the donors is the missed biography, Dan. And Dan, I value you and follow your thoughts as well, and appreciate your engagement with me and encourage me. But I also value you and your observations in their own right. So, look, the first thing is, do you really understand the donors you have? And so one of the most important set of questions would be, first, why did you give? So important with the first gift, just tell us why. You just crossed our threshold. You did something sweet, nice, and wonderful. Why? What did you hope for? What did we do that you thought was noteworthy? You see, right away, you're going to evoke something about me. Well, I'm going to tell you something that you touched in me, and you want to capture that because that's how we build a relationship. You get to know me better, and then you start to feed me what I most want from my connection to your organization, or you miss that. So just tell us why, and listen for that personal. There's something there that you did that touched me. Well, I remember when something like that happened to me or a loved one, and I think what you're doing here is helpful. Or, you gave a scholarship. I was a scholarship recipient. You have an emergency fund for students who fell on hard times. I remember, my sister had a terrible time in college when it happened. Right? It's personal. If we can't understand that giving ties back to something deeply personal, and that's what we want to discover, then we're going to miss relationship building, which is ironically what we keep saying we do. Oh, it's all about relationships. Well, sorry, folks, most of them are pretty superficial and a little cold. You don't know me as well as you think you do, and you really haven't asked me questions to show. Donors won't say that, but that's what they feel. So why did you give? The other gold question is, because philanthropy is biography, philanthropy is personal, is to which cause or purpose do you give the most and why? I give to at-risk children. Why? I was at risk, so I know somebody was at risk. I was touched, right? It's personal. I give to music. Why? Symphony orchestra. I played an instrument. And then when I know, I feed. When I know what you need, I feed. Let's take that away as a mantra. When I know what you need, I feed you what you want, and you grow closer. I love nourishing. You love being nourished. Right now we have a nice relationship, and we look forward to seeing each other, and we want to work together. So to what cause or purpose to give the most and why? But peel away the layers. Not, oh, I saw a mailer, but why did that respond to you? What did that speak to you about? I had somebody one day say, well, it doesn't speak to me. I just think, I should help people who are intellectually challenged. I said, really? It doesn't speak to you in any way? I kept poking, and he goes, well, I know I was gifted. I know I was lucky. I was born with a good brain. Well, okay, now we have a philanthropist, because what we find in philanthropists is not, aren't I wonderful, but aren't I lucky? And boy, life isn't always fair. I was born with advantages. I had breaks, and they didn't. I hear grandparents putting their grandchildren through children. They said it was easier to make a living when we were building our careers than it is for our children. So we're helping our grandchildren. So to what cause or purpose do you give a why? Dig, dig, dig. find that interpersonal? And then how do you move up in people's hierarchy? If you know what's most valuable to them biographically, therefore philanthropically, don't compete with their favorite cause, try to align with it. Oh, in our organization, this is what we're doing that approximates what you care about, right? So let's talk about that. I give to veterans organizations. Oh, did you know on our campus, we've got a really good, strong, and we're attracting a number of veterans. You see, you start this matchmaking, you start this alignment of purpose. And then, you know, as you listen over time, you'll hear people's philanthropic lens change a little bit because it usually has to do with health, or where you started, Louis, something like COVID did move the philanthropic lens. In our feasibility studies, you know what fascinated me is people moved over to food banks. They saw the pictures on the news of cars lined up. They realized there were more vulnerable people in our world, so they're given to XY, never to food banks, and all of a sudden said, there's a real pressing human need. It's getting stronger because some people, like wait staff, can't get to work, or some people at the most vulnerable stages can't, and they started giving to food banks. It was disruptive, but you see what a beautiful thing it was, is I see a real pressing human need. I see a way to act on it. I see differences, way to make a difference. I'll give. Why is that personal? Well, just about everybody can relate to being hungry and worrying about where your next meal can come from. Even if you haven't personally experienced it, I mean, it's so basic that it touches all of us. Oh, we take that for granted. Here I am eating a nice meal, and someone may be worrying about where the next one comes from. So, you know, get into this listening toward the personal, and then watch how deeply respected people feel, how grateful they are that you showed that interest in them. So it yields a stronger human connection, and it informs strategy. I know what they care about, not in a manipulative way, but I know what they care about. And in my next interaction with them or with a group of people, as themes emerge, as in annual giving, they need to hear more about what? Students in trouble. One of my favorite ones from Simon Fraser was an experiment was single parent students, college students, single parents raising children. They just put it in their annual fund as an option. Would you like to help them? Touched one of those personal nerves. Former single parent said, oh, isn't it sweet? Somebody noticed people like us. And what a rare set of struggles that is to get through college and raise a child on your own. Anyway, you see, when you listen, you respond, you feed, and you create communities of shared purpose. And we're going to have to create communities of shared purposes in those big organizations, micro communities that will add up to total community. But thank you, Dan. Hope that wasn't too long-winded.
Thank you, Jim. So it can be as simple as that.
Everything is as simple as people helping people, of joining together and helping one another out. And the donor loves being able to help, and the love that somebody cared enough to see themselves in them.
Lovely. And that, I think that reminds me of a question that Courtney posed in the chat too. She says, by being more donor-centric, should we ever worry about mission creep for the organization? So this feeling that if you're listening to somebody, you're somehow going to lose, what you stand for.
No, it's a very fair question, and I don't mean to ridicule, but to state a kind of an extreme, so that we can look at it is, well, what happens to mission when it becomes removed from day-to-day human reality? You're preserving mission at what price, right? That can happen in certain faiths, right? You adhere to a certain rigid set of beliefs, and sociologically we change and think about faith perhaps more broadly, more spiritually, less denominationally. What happens to that faith? What happened to Shakers, right? They preserved mission. Remember them? They didn't believe in sex. Not a bad principle not a good principle for regenerating interest in your faith. But they thought it was taboo. So how many shakers are there around today? They produce beautiful furniture, but there aren't many of them around. So you see what I mean? Is relevance is adaptation. So what we don't want is to veer, to your very good question, is to just start doing things to please people, but to start being more malleable in defining mission in response to what people are saying. It isn't just pleasing people for their own sake. It's saying, oops, to better deliver on our mission, we need to adjust to these new realities being voiced by key constituents. I hope that makes sense. So that's how you maintain relevance over time. Mission relevance is to respond to adaptation, necessary adaptation, not to be kind of categorically rigid about mission, but to say mission lives as it responds to changing need, but within our wheelhouse. So if you're in the business of, let's say, what would be a good nonprofit to think about being, that must be, let's say, addressing poverty, you must remain mission centered and not veer, or let's say homelessness, you have to, but then you have to say, what are the causes that might be contributing to that, or what are new contributing factors that we need to adjust to, or even what are new ways of communicating to younger generations that we haven't picked up on. That's what we're talking about. It's not doing something wholly different from mission, but seeing how mission can better be articulated or better delivered based on changing human need. It's a great question. Don't add a bunch of new businesses, but take whatever your core business is and make sure it hasn't gotten removed from lived realities of those you purport to serve.
That reminds me of the interest now, the rightful interest in diversity, equity, inclusion, which shouldn't be a new business, should just be, well, we should have always done it, right?
Yeah, but it's got a new language, doesn't it? And it's got a new language among younger generations is, wait a second, are you addressing what I'm addressing? The other thing is, so you take that, Louis, which is always important, right? We're so far away from being as democratic and as inclusive as we should be, and as valuing of diversity as we should be. But let's take someone of my generation who may have a laudable career in being progressive. Young people in their 20s don't want to be lectured by aging progressives about what they did in their time. They want you to hear about what they're up against in their time. So you see this funny dynamic. Well, let me tell you, because I've got the scars, and you're starting to lecture, and you're starting to trying to want to say my position is to be valued. It's like learning. The minute you stop learning, you can't teach. You have no right to teach. So if you're an aging progressive, you need to listen to younger generations and hear what the world looks like through, and not tell them what you did in your time, but say, what can I do with the knowledge I have, with the experience I have, to help you with what you're experiencing, and you'll get alignment.
Thank you, Jim. Let me go on to a question from our common friend, Ron Cohen. He says, the movement you speak of tends to hit the wall at the governing board table, including president and CEO. Are you seeing any evidence out there of weakening of that wall?
Well, yeah. Thank you, Ron. Yeah, a little bit, but of course, maybe it's self-selection. People who hire me to start the process of rethinking and realignment, and very often will ask me to come in and speak to boards, or speak to the president, or work with the president. So maybe there's a little bit of self-selection there, but even the fact that people hire me for that reason know that getting to boards is important. And so when I speak to boards, do I get some resistance and adherence to the old way? Yes. But do I get some people going, oh my, because I use data and show trends in philanthropy and sociological trends, is, oh, We didn't realize that. That makes so much sense. And we got some people saying, I felt this way all along, and I couldn't get the rest of these chuckleheads on the board to listen to me, right? So you get these sort of gradients of thought. So boards are not monolithic. And just to my earlier point, I think what you have to do is touch on what's personal to that board member about his or her engagement in that organization. Let's come back to why we're here, why you aligned with it, and then is that why being responded to going forward? But you're right, Ron, that it's where boards are where lagging practice gets preserved most assiduously, and where very powerful people just assert, this is the way I always felt, without data, bereft of any kind of updating of what's going on in the world. And so it takes a strong personality to go with them and not be, offended, but say, well, let me show you the data, let me show you what's happening, and hope that over time you change those conditions. But there's where the challenge is. People like me are trying to work our way up the food chain to get to those places, and knowing that's where change must be effected. So step by step. But my advice to all of you is get the data that shows these trends. It's out there. People like Lewis and I are trying to put it out on a regular basis. Share it with your leaders and ask them to move it up, to say, just so we know what we're up against, where opportunities lie, where we could better spend our time and money, and maybe where we're going to spin our wheels. Let's get more intelligent about raising money. Push the data up. And don't talk about your hunches, and don't talk about these broad terms like it's about relationships. What do you mean? We've said that all along. Oh, it's about relationships. What does that mean? Build out that theory. Support it with data, like the average donor who gives, $1 million is given for 15 to 17 years previously. You see? Oh, it's about sustained loyalty over time, right? Oh, and that loyal donor tends to attend more events and be more present. Right? Push this data up so we see how to grow more philanthropic trees. Get past game playing, image building, being all-knowing fundraisers, and say, we're listeners, we're information gatherers, we're followers of trends, and let's pay attention to this. Push it up.
Thank you, Jim. Another data-related question from Kara Merkins. Thanks so much for joining, Kara. She asks, with prospect research being so data-focused, how can we support others in relationship building, tracking interests, any philanthropy? What else?
What a fabulous question. So my critique is we're information rich and insight poor. You see, we just sort of started casting these nets out. Information. And then we had these purveyors. Information. What information? What information gives us insight into relationships? What insight gives us into the mind of a philanthropist, and how's that shifting over time from generation? So Ron, who just was on, has worked on a recent survey in which he asked a group of constituents, donors, which kind of, how do you see yourself as, what's your philosophy of giving? And he gave them certain descriptors of giving. I plan well ahead, I think carefully. And one that he put out there was, I give what I want, and I give I give when I feel the need for it, and I give as I see the need. And this was an older constituency, boomers, I would say, maybe even some World War II generation, largely. That was the number one way of giving that they identified with. Oh, boy, did we just learn something that, your messaging may be wrong, because this new donor is saying, when I resonates with me and I see the need, not your institutional need, but the human need, right? The human opportunity. So there you go. That's great information that gives us insight, not only into single donors, but groups of donors, and then goes, oh, let's look at our outreach, our literature, our communication. How well are we talking about human need that we're responding to, right? So what we have to do is to get more insight, which is actually less information broadly defined, and deeper information into human motivation. And I believe some of the new frontiers will be behavioral science and human psychology. So some people may be stunned to realize, well, they say Jim's a thought leader. Who's he following to become wiser and more helpful? Oh, people like Esther Perel, a psychoanalyst who talks about relationships and talks about what makes relationships work. She's wonderful. If you don't know her, I think she's actually pronounces her name Esther Perel, Perel. Wonderful stuff on relationships. You'll benefit from it personally, and you'll benefit from professionally. She says things like, every human in every relationship, every person encounters disappointment. It's how you deal with disappointment that sustains the relationship. Oh, you don't think our donors are disappointed with us? How are we deal to some degree at some point? How are we dealing with it? I follow Pema Chandra, a Buddhist, who talks about you can't understand others until you better understand yourself. You see, so what we've got to do is get deeper and understand that while most of us ascribe to the fact that it's relationship, we're not going to get better unless we look at people, thought leaders, research, scholarship into how we guide our lives, how we relate to others, and how we sustain relationships and affinities over time to achieve a greater good together. So I'm looking at these frontiers of knowledge and hope you'll join me and start feeding the advancement profession with these other fields. I get all the time, what do you read, Jim? Or at a conference, what text on advancement would you recommend? Well, other than my own and some of the people I value, but they're always surprised by what I read that's so well outside of advancement that helps me help the field, helps me help the field.
And Jim, I think I have a good example for Kara of this data versus insight, and it is based on some behavioral science, but it's a fairly known fact that we're closer to the people we spend more time with. And that applies to teens, to our friends, to our family. Estranged means not only emotionally, but by distance, you just don't see the person. So why aren't we measuring more of that? I'm sure if you looked at your low-level donors or your donors that just give once and disappear, I'm sure you barely see them digitally or in real life. I'm sure your major donors you're seeing all the time, or they're meeting in groups that are related to you, right, Tim?
Right. And Louis, where's the greatest turnover? At what stage do we lose most donors? First gift. Mm-hmm. Right. And then, just this small donors. Well, they're not wee people. They're not leprechauns. Those things we call small donors may be giving generously within their means. They may be actually giving more generously within their means than those people that we're doting on, right? So wait a minute, here you've got these wonderful little germs of real philanthropy that we're not engaging. And a few questions, as we said, those here and there with those donors, giving at what we would characterize as modest levels, but meaningful to them. What are we doing to nourish that, to recognize that, to pull that more deeply into our organization and thereby lessen the rate of turnover after initial giving? Just to support again, Louis, and what you're saying is we look longitudinally at institutions. We do something called a vital signs assessment, and we say, how many donors have given for 1 to 5 years, for 1 to 10 years, et cetera, in gradients, right? So they lose most after the first year. The highest levels of giving are 1 to 5 years, and then erosion after that point, and by age group. So, with every passing decade, fewer young people coming in and more erosion. To your point, you just keep reacquiring them as donors, but you never get to know them as human beings. Mm-hmm. And that fades quickly. It's like, here they come again. But has my life gotten more interesting? Do I feel better about my giving? Does anybody know what I'm trying to achieve? Let me move over here because that looks more interesting. And that's where that small organization does so well, in my experience, of you give a gift, you get an immediate response. Sometimes you get a call from a board member or a text from a board member, right? Amazing what you'll see now at these smaller organizations that are community focused, how quickly they'll respond to a gift with affirmation, a question, what can we provide you?
And speed builds trust, right? Speed and response, just like with anything.
Oh, so true. What a great point. Speed, the rapidity. And it's not the official receipt of your gift, right? We crank that out in 48 hours. Okay. Good for us. But we saw, thank you so much, right? It's the perfunctory. We go, oh, well, it's the efficiency. No, what speed and what? Oh, wasn't that nice? It's that human response. Did you ever stretch yourself to make a gift? Like I've done this, to a nonprofit, really stretched myself. And then the executive director, the person who I'd been working with, takes 2 weeks to say, I noticed that gift, right? Something's wrong in that organization. Hey, one of your board members just tripled before the day is over. Respond.
Mm-hmm. And so what I love about your perspective, Jim, is that you look at it from a leadership and campaign fundraising level. The donor participation project seems like a very natural complement. That's why we're thrilled to have you, which is kind of a grassroots effort. If anybody's here, I would invite you to join us.
So important to Louis, what you're doing, and we're trying to get this everywhere we can, right? As I said, I am trying to get at corridors of influence, but let's work on this at every level so it's inescapable, right? So when people are applying for advancement jobs, they say, I ascribe to sustainable philanthropy practices. Do you? Like we do with LEED certification, or we do with no, well, I think we do. What are you referring to, right? So we all start going, well, these are the thought leaders, these are the schools of thought, these are the practices I'm looking for. And believe me, because there's such a need for talent, there's so many open positions now in advancement. If we start saying, we're looking for sustainable practices as articulated by our favorite thought leaders, watch what happens, because they've got to hire people. They've got too many openings.
And Jim, how do you see campaigns are changing or should change?
So it's largely an artificial construct born of a very different time, which was a harvest of accrued goodwill over generations or decades, right? And so, the organizations that had done so much good for so long saw an inflection moment, saw an opportunity to make an even greater difference, and called upon the people that it had served so well for so long to say, we, the people, can render an even greater service, or, do something that's even more impactful. Join us as we make this bold move, right? Until to something that's a packaged exercise that seems to want to be a stimulus to give people to give, and basically only causes board members to give, right? So the best way I can puncture that is the public phase. What public? Who's waiting out there for your organization to go public? Where's the Margin Earl of the world saying, let's keep our philanthropic powder dry until somebody goes public so we can respond? The only public you have is the constituency that you've built through listening, through caring, through serving over time. Stop talking about public and start talking about, is there a nurtured constituency that we can turn to? And is there a greater good that we can articulate and put a price tag on to say, if you give us X, we can convert it to these kinds of outcomes. So it's a substance-driven campaign, outcome-driven campaign. It's project and initiative-oriented, and it either taps into nurtured goodwill, nurtured through performance, or to like-minded philanthropists elsewhere who will join us in pursuit of those objectives. But that old campaign is full of fluff and nonsense. It's expensive. It's, we have launch events. We come in and go, who attended your launch event? Faculty, staff, or staff, board members. let's look at your major donors as you articulate your top 100 donors and how many came to your events. You see, you're putting on a show, but the right people aren't coming. You're producing brochures when white paper, simple draft documents would do much better. You're marketing, and you're trying to wow people into philanthropic submission rather than create alignments of purpose, right? So the old campaign is so expensive, so gassy, so time consuming, and so non-eventful to most donors. Survey donors to most campaigns, and they didn't even know you were in a campaign, or said being in a campaign did not affect the reason I gave. The ones that might have affected would be board members and quintessential insiders. So we got to get better at that, right? And you got to stop throwing so much money at hollow marketing exercises and spend more on substantive listening exercises.
Thank you, Jim. So we're nearing the top of the hour. I want to invite everybody who's here today to ask that last question on their mind that they're going to be sorry that they didn't ask. But
I see one here, if I could respond
exactly.
to that. Yeah,
yes.
So the person following me on LinkedIn, and he says Dickinson College, who I've worked closely with for years, revolutionary challenge, right? So yeah, curious if you could talk about that. So yes, Dickinson College staged what they call a revolutionary challenge, a We the People exercise. The president at the time came in and said something, like, we need to be more about co-innovation. And some people said, wait a second, don't the powers that be have to come forward with strategic plans, strategic pillars, and tell the great unwashed how to advance the strategic pillars? She said, no, it has to be more organic. It has to be more about co-innovation. Oh, the skeptic said, wait a second, you're going to ask alumni for ideas about how to advance the institution, about whither the institution should go. Won't you get a lot of crazy ideas? And to which she said, I thought something so touching and brilliant to the faculty. She said, if we've done as good a job as we say we have in teaching our students, we ought to have more trust and confidence in our alumni. And the hair on the back of my neck went up is because, volunteers are difficult to work with. How much should we trust our own people to help guide the future, our own donors, our own alumni? Well, wait a second. You say you taught them critical thinking skills. You say you've done a wonderful job teaching them. I wondered from that if this loss of trust in institutions could be traced back to a lack of trust institutions have in their own donors and their own adherents. That they don't trust them enough to listen and to supply insight about where that direction should come from, which cause those donors to feel mistrust toward the institution. And if the way we're not going to build trust going forward is to demonstrate it by trusting your opinions, by trusting your expertise, see the validity of what you say, and watch what happens, right? So they did, and wonderful things happened. We just have a couple of minutes left. They asked for ideas. They got hundreds of ideas. They winnowed them down. They put some of the best ideas on their website, and they invited alumni to rate them, to interact with them. Something like 3,000 alumni were involved in that process, spent time with it, rated ideas. And you said to them, celebratorily, when was the last time 3,000 alumni did anything around any single event, function, or purpose? And so I'll say to all of you, when you are brave enough to co-innovate and to say, let's imagine a future together, let's learn from your talent, your experience, let's open ourselves to peer-based dialogue in which you challenge us, you will give up a certain amount of authority to gain co-innovation, trust, dynamism. And so you've got to give up something to get something which is more like we the people, creating more perfect institutions in more uneven ways, in more maddening ways, but you've got to rely on the formula that the democracy of the caring and the informed is better than the aristocracy of the detached and the removed. What do you really believe in?
Thank you, Jim. I wish I could just get that clip and put it on my desktop. It is true. And all in all, people, do understand. I have trouble understanding the reticence sometimes when, people do understand reasons for which not to do things. Not everything is possible. You can't build a building, you can't build, there's just things that are not possible, right? So it's the conversation that so deeply matters. And this conversation today was very important, I feel, and touching. I hope people in the chat in the last few minutes, if you have a message for Jim or you just like to say bye, can feel free to do so on our end, Jim.
Great. And we'll meet on LinkedIn and let's keep the conversation going. Let's keep it going. But please share your frustrations, your experiences, your good examples. Keep feeding so we can all cite others making these incremental advances. At some point, it will add up to something wonderful.
Lovely. Thank you so much. Have a great one.
Thank you, Louis. I value you.
Thank you, Jim.